It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. This is your host, Michael Shermer. Guess what? We have a new sponsor. I'm very excited to tell you about it. Company's called Wren, W-R-E-N. It's a startup that's making it easy for everyone to make a meaningful difference in the climate crisis. Now, you know my position on this. I've talked about that a lot on the show. I do accept the climate science, that is, global warming is real and it's human caused. I'm not an apocalyptic doomsayer. I think there's something we can do about it. And Wren is a company that's making inroads on that front. It's a startup that allows you to calculate your carbon footprint and then offset it by supporting awesome climate projects that plant trees and protect rainforests and remove CO2 from the sky. So signing up for Wren is an easy way to do something meaningful about the climate issues we currently face. On the day I'm recording this, by the way, England recorded the hottest day ever in history, 104 degrees. Yeah, you think this is not real? It's real. So Wren practices hyper-transparency. Once you sign up, make a monthly contribution to offset your carbon footprint, you receive monthly updates about the tree planting, rainforest protection, and carbon removal projects that you're funding. You can even see the exact coordinates of the trees you planted. This is really super cool. So it's going to take all of us. No one person can solve this problem. All of us doing a little bit every day. And you can do your part by going to Wren, WREN.co/Shermer. Sign up. And guess what? They will plant 10 trees in your name. That's all you got to do. Just go to Wren, WREN.co/Shermer, SHERMER. Sign up and they'll plant 10 trees in your name. So check it out. I've already done it, obviously, and I just think this is a great project. So I'm honored to have them supporting the podcast. And, of course, as always, I appreciate your support and listening. So check it out, WREN.co/Shermer. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium. You know Wondrium, the former Great Courses, the teaching company, presenting you college-level courses by hundreds of different highly ranked professors. But Wondrium offers something new, that is to say, documentary series, television shows, individual films, and all kinds of tutorials and lessons you can take in all sorts of things like winemaking and photography and music appreciation and so on. I mostly do the courses on history, philosophy, science, and so on. I've mentioned this one before, but I just finished it yesterday. This is History of World War I, 36 lectures at 30 minutes each. This was really enlightening. I thought I knew a lot about this war. There was a lot I didn't know. For example, pretty much everything in the world today was affected by that colossal event a century ago. There's very little you can discuss in world politics today that doesn't somehow go back to that event. I mean, you're talking the EU, the UN, NATO, all that, American world policy and foreign policy, all affected by that colossal event. Anyway, I just want to recommend that as my pick of the week. So check it out. It's wondrium.com/Shermer. You get a free trial plus 20% off the annual fee. So go to wondrium.com, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer. You know the spelling, SHERMER, wondrium.com/Shermer. Take that free trial. Why would you not? It's free. And then take some courses. And if you don't like it, you can always sign off. I don't know why you would. But the free trial gets you plenty of time to check it out. So, all right. My guest today is James Kirchick, who has written about human rights, politics, and culture from around the world. A columnist for Tablet Magazine, a writer at large for Airmail, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He is the author of The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. I haven't read that one yet, but that's going to be next on my audiobook list. Kirchick's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New York Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement. He's a graduate of Yale with degrees in history and political science, and he resides in Washington, D.C. His new book is, here it is, The Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Look at this beauty. It's a tome. I read the whole thing, Jamie, in audio. It was like 30 hours, and I did it. I was pretty proud of myself. I got myself back into fitness shape on my bike by listening to your book. So thanks for coming
Great
on
to
the
hear.
show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
By the way, let me note, I'm a consumer of physical books. I have hundreds of them here in my office. I love a nice physical book. This one is really beautifully done, and Henry Holt is also my publisher. But just the
Oh,
design, the layout, the typography, the feel of the paper, the beautiful photographic plates they inserted in there, and the design of the cover. I really appreciate that. I still like a nice physical book.
I'm like you. I'm very old fashioned. Although I don't listen to books at all on audio, so I haven't even gotten that far yet. But
Yeah, I don't do ebooks either, but and the other thing I noticed, just for fun, I looked up some of the reviews. They're mostly popular reviews. The book made the New York Times bestseller list, which is really unusual for a long history book. So that tells you there's a lot of interest, a market interest in it. Clearly, if people are willing to buy and read a long book like that. As an author myself, I'm always amused by reviews that are unnecessarily hostile. Almost all your reviews were really positive. The one in the New York Times was superb, and I pretty much agree with that. But what's with the one in the Washington Post by somebody who just seemed like he had a chip on his shoulder?
I'm not. I don't want to speak to any specific
Okay.
reviews, other than to say I've been just immensely gratified with the response to the book, particularly from individual readers, and that's really what matters to me most, actually, more than the critics,
Mm,
or the actual,
yeah.
the mass people, the mass audience who's going to buy the book.
Yeah. I'm never sure if reviews actually make any difference in terms of who wants to read it or how they're exposed to it. It's a long, curious
Mm.
thing. And to me, it's always almost a paranormal mystery of how books get on the bestseller list or not. It's so hard to predict. But so
Well,
let's
there's
start
sort of an
off with just,
alchemy.
Oh, yeah, an
I was going
alchemy,
to
right? Yeah,
There's sort of an
exactly.
alchemy to how those bestseller lists are determined. There's a certain number of specific bookstores that are part of the bestseller kind of
Mm,
group.
mm.
So who knows?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So, as a fellow historian, I'm always curious how writers get their sources. Yours must have been somewhat challenging, given the fact that it is a secret history and that it's probably
Mm.
not obvious where to get the sources to find out all these things. So, just talk to us a little bit about how you did the research. You said you took 10 years to write this thing. I can see why.
On and off. Yeah. I think the sources really mostly came from archival documents, old documents of some form or another. So when I think of, the opening couple chapters detail really the first sort of gay scandal in the American government, which is a man named Sumner Welles, who was the Undersecretary of State to FDR, and he was pushed out of the government for being gay. He's sort of the first victim of this policy. And one of his antagonists was a very colorful figure named William Bullitt, who was the first ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was married to Louise Bryant, who was John Reed's widow. He came from a very wealthy mainline Philadelphia family, and he was the one who was really trying to pressure Roosevelt to fire Wells because Wells was his adversary, his enemy. And Bullitt's papers are at Yale, where I actually went to school. And Bullitt kept very detailed notes and diaries of all his conversations with the president. So there's all these great sort of minute by minute, almost transcriptions. Although of course, when you're dealing with someone's own recordings of their conversations, you have to take into account, it might not have been as accurate as actually happened, right? This is through his own memory. He's trying to put his own gloss on it. But he basically wrote out, like the minute he left the Oval Office, he was yelling at FDR to convince him to fire Bullitt. He would write down these meticulous notes of what those exchanges were like. So I used those a lot. I used a lot of declassified FBI files. In fact, I think one of the proudest discoveries I made was of a man named Robert Waldron, who was an aide to LBJ, and it's a very tragic story. He was a gay man. He worked for LBJ when LBJ was Senate Majority Leader, all the way up until the weeks after the Kennedy assassination, when LBJ is basically preparing. He is president. He's moving into the White House. There's a background check by the Civil Service Commission into Waldron because he's going to join the White House staff. They discover that he's gay and he's fired immediately. And I found the Civil Service Commission records of their investigation, and the FBI did a follow-up investigation into this man. It was over 1,000 pages. They interviewed dozens of people. I found the letter that Waldron wrote to the man who outed him to the Civil Service Commission. And I'm proud to say, not even Robert Caro found, knows of this story. I actually discovered this on my own. I actually told Robert Caro about it at a party I saw him at. So that was a great find. And I think it's a really important story because it shows you someone very close to a president who was gay and who suffered because of it. And then I think the biggest scoop in the book is of this really kind of crazy, wild tale involving a group of men around Ronald Reagan. It was alleged that there was this right-wing, homosexual, anti-communist cabal that was basically controlling Ronald Reagan since the days of when he was governor. In these accusations, there was a congressman actually near your neck of the woods, Pete McCloskey, who's still alive, who was a liberal Republican who ran against Richard Nixon from the left in the as a Republican in 1972. He's sort of the one spearheading this attempt to expose this nefarious right-wing homosexual cabal. He brings kind of a dossier. He knocks on Ben Bradley's door, the legendary editor of the Washington Post, and delivers him this dossier of information relating to this supposed, gay cabal. This has never been reported on before. I found it in Ben Bradley's papers, which are housed at the University of Texas. So I did a lot of archival research in college. I got to know Sam Tannenhouse, who at the time was the New York Times book review editor. He had written a biography of Whittaker Chambers. He's still writing of what should be a monumental biography of William F. Buckley Jr. And I got my passion for doing archival research, working for Sam, doing research in Bill Buckley's papers at Yale. And so that was a real skill that I developed and a real passion that I developed. The first big story I ever published as a journalist was I discovered Ron Paul's like crazy racist conspiratorial newsletters, if you remember that. That was when he was running for president in 2008. And I found this, he had published this newsletter. This is before blogs and Twitter and everything. He had published this newsletter, and he was sort of on the fringe of kind of the libertarian movement. And he would send this newsletter that was, partly concerned with like gold bug, bringing back the gold standard, that kind of stuff. But he was also really, really into kind of any crazy right-wing conspiracy, whether it was like militias or Jewish conspiracies or conspiracies about AIDS. And they were all in this newsletter. And I found, the old copies of this newsletter. And that was when I was 25, a 25-year-old reporter at the New Republic. So I've found that there's so much sitting in archives. If you're a journalist and you're looking for something new to say and you want to find a topic, just go to an archive. There's so many archives across the country, and you will find something fascinating. Believe me.
Yeah. Not everything is online in terms of like going to Wikipedia to get what you need. No, you really still got to dig. Yeah, it'll be interesting what future historians how they deal with all the online archives, because you just send emails now, and if somebody purges their emails, how do you know where are they? You can't get them. So the Ron Paul thing. If I could just do a little sidebar, a little side trip here for a moment. I've met him. He used to go to Freedom Fest that I go to every summer, which is kind of a collection of libertarian types. It's kind of amusing. I'm sort of their science guy to keep them straight, on climate change and vaccines and things like that. But I've always been curious why is it because they're sort of fringy already as a political movement? They're attracted to, gold and guns and the apocalypse is coming and the preppers and all that stuff. What is your sense about that?
I think there is kind of a lower threshold for whom they'll welcome. It's sort of part of their ideology, right? We're libertarians. We believe in freedom. We believe in however you want to live your life. And I obviously, and you as well, I know there's a lot admirable in that philosophy. I think we could use a lot more of it actually in this country. People minding their own business and living their lives as they like. But it's not the best philosophy to have when you're trying to sort of screen out wackos and whack jobs and nutters. So you'll find you go to these conventions, you'll find some types of people who perhaps have views that, while I believe you should be able to believe whatever you want and say whatever you want, I'm a free speech absolutist. I wouldn't be making common cause necessarily with everyone who happens to agree with me on a couple of issues. There are some people I think who are beyond the pale. And Ron Paul, he had, I mean, first of all, I don't even know if he wrote the newsletters himself. It might have been this guy, Lou Rockwell. That was sort of the
Yeah,
story,
right, right. He
the
said he
Mises
didn't.
Institute, which is,
Right.
he said he didn't. But look, at the end of the day, he was responsible for any, I mean,
Hmm.
if I'm publishing the James Kirchick report, okay, and I
Yeah, right,
contract out the writing, and I contract out the writing to someone else, it doesn't matter. I'm responsible for whatever appears under my name. So,
right. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, I had, and along those lines, I had Yoram Hazani on recently with his, conservatism, a rediscovery, and he really set me straight on a
yeah.
lot of things because I would portray conservatives as saying they're in favor of freedom and liberty and autonomy and people should do whatever they want,
Mm.
but they don't actually believe that.
No.
What consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedroom very much concerns at least these old school conservatives, right? Because they have this argument that it's going to erode the moral fabric of the country and the nation. It's almost a collectivist argument. The nation is over and above the family is over and above the individual. So you sacrifice individual rights for these larger collectives. Kind of a weird idea
Yes.
for conservatives.
Yeah, well, this is a different type of conservatism. It's a new right, or it's kind of the old right coming back in, new bottles, I guess you could say, old wine in new bottles. But yeah, I have a lot of beef with Yoram Hazoni. So
Okay, yes, I'm sure you do. Is it your sense? I'm fond of saying along the lines that Steve Pinker argues that conservatives today are more liberal than liberals were in the 1950s, at least socially, in terms of blacks and women and gays and Jews and so forth. But now I'm kind of starting to second guess that, given the last 5 years or so of things we've been going through on conservatives
well, I think
and
there's so many
populists.
varieties of conservative. There's so many varieties of
Mm.
conservatism right now. They're really cracking up, and there's so many different um, camps. And in some respects, I think Trump, if there's a silver lining to his presidency, maybe he obviated the obsession that we have with sex
Mm.
in politics, right? The sort of sexual peccadillos of our leaders. Because if you
Mm.
have evangelical Christians supporting a thrice married guy who's basically the villain from a Sunday school parable, they've kind of lost the credibility to attack other people for their private lives, I think. So I wonder if
Hmm.
the rise of Donald Trump in that sense has maybe obviated the issue of sex in politics. Maybe I'm wrong, but it does seem that it might have that effect.
One of the other things I loved about reading your book is all the events that I was familiar with, but the different angle or twist or insight that you
Mm.
provide to it, like in the Reagan years and so on. I mean, I remember all those things that happened, Ollie North and all that stuff. But one of the few things I assumed had to be true is that J. Edgar Hoover was a gay guy and the cross dressing, all that stuff. And wow, what a surprise! You debunked this myth, or at least you show that it's not obviously true.
Well, he may have been gay. There's no evidence, and like you, I'm a skeptic, and unless I see evidence, I'm not, as a historian, I'm not going to make that assertion. There's no evidence that he was gay, by which I mean that he had sexual relations or even an emotional attachment to people of the same sex. He certainly had a very close relationship with his number two, Clyde Tolson. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that they might have been lovers, right? I mean, they lived together, they lived right near each other, they traveled together on vacations, they ate lunch every day at the Mayflower Hotel. You can see these photographs of them looking quite admiringly upon one another. But unless I see letters or some kind of witness testimony to, a gay life, I'm not going to make that claim. The cross-dressing thing is a total urban myth, and it derives from it was a very kind of sensational biography that came out in the early 90s. It was written by a writer for British newspapers, so make of that what you will. He had paid the widow of a mob boss to tell him this story that she had witnessed Hoover, in a dress at an orgy in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York. um, so yeah, there's just no evidence for either of these claims, but there was certainly there was a perception that Hoover was a queer, right, in the vernacular of the time. And it's alluded to and insinuated very early on in his career. I mean, I cite these, media reports published in the early 1930s, right, when he's just created the Bureau of Investigation, as it was called at the time. and it's referring to his, he walks with a mince in his step. The New York Times reports in one paragraph or one sentence, they say he lives with his mother, he's a bachelor, and he collects antiques, which are, is really kind of sending the message that there's something off about this guy. Drew Pearson, who was this notorious muckraking journalist for decades in Washington, who wrote a column called "The Washington Merry-Go-Round," he would, frequently insinuate that the director was a queer. And in his notes, in his letters, his diaries, which I've read, he's constantly, invoking this. And it's also important to note that the director himself and the Bureau were very sensitive to these rumors. And I tell the story, and there's many of them like this, of a group of women who are playing bridge one day they have a weekly bridge club, and it's in northwestern Pennsylvania, rural northwestern Pennsylvania. It's 1943. One of the women mentions, apropos of nothing, that she heard the director of the FBI is a queer. Now, unfortunately for her, one of the other women in this bridge club, her nephew was an agent in the FBI. She tells him, he kicks it up the ladder, and it finds its way back to Washington. And the next thing this woman knows, she's being summoned to the FBI field office, and she's being given a lecture by a G-man. Where did you hear this? Why are you spreading this rumor in a time of war? The director's job is to protect the country. How dare you? Basically puts the fear of God in her. And she goes back and tells all the other women she doesn't know what came over her. It was a mistake. She didn't know what she was thinking, blah, blah, blah. And this happens multiple times, that just random American citizens will be having a conversation that they have every right to assume is a private conversation. And then the next thing they know, they're getting a knock on the door from FBI agents. So clearly the director was extremely concerned about this. I think it goes to show you the extent to which what I call the specter of homosexuality really haunted not just our nation's capital, but our country. That there was this incredible fear of homosexuality, of gay people, that it was really the worst thing you could possibly be. This was the most despised group of people. It was so terrible. You couldn't even speak of them. You couldn't even say the word homosexual. One of the things I discovered in this book was all the euphemisms that various people had come up with over the years, over the centuries, right, to describe this terrible, terrible thing, which is now something that we largely look at as being left-handed, which I think is the correct attitude. Homosexuality is a morally neutral trait. It doesn't make someone any better or any worse than anybody else. But not that long ago, the vast majority of people in this country and our institutions had a completely different conception of it.
Right. Yes. Well, it's only 2015 that we have gay marriage as the law of the land. In 2011, before the majority of Americans said they have no objections to same-sex marriage, right? Even Obama and Hillary in 2008 both publicly stated they did not support same-sex marriage. That's pretty recent. Oh my gosh.
It is. It is. And I think I'm talking to younger people when I with this book, and they have no conception of what it was like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s when my book begins. And I just remember during the Trump years, and I was not a fan of Donald Trump like you. I certainly didn't vote for him. But I remember people would say, "Oh, he's the worst president in history for LGBT Americans." No. And I just said, this is really something else. I mean, he was probably better on LGBT issues than Bill Clinton. I mean, it's
right.
Which is not to say he was great or anything, but I mean, it's just a complete lack of historical understanding. And it is this pessimism, which I think is something you probably come across a lot in your work. It's this sense of that things are only getting worse, that they've never been worse. And you see that a lot today. And I can only speak about my area of expertise, which is this book and this history of gay people. I'm happy to say there's never been a better time to be gay in America than the present.
Yeah. Yeah, Pinker discusses this in Enlightenment Now, this kind of progressiphobia, this idea that, bad news sells better than good news, and that pundits who comment on terrible things get more readership, more eyeballs, more attention, and they're perceived to be more insightful. And that if you say, well, things are, slowly but surely getting better, that just sounds like you're naive. Whereas if you, can portray this kind of catastrophic doom coming, you're considered to be this
Yeah.
deeply insightful person. I'm not sure why that is in human psychology, other than the negativity bias, that like loss aversion in economics, that losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. And because of entropy, there's more ways for things to go wrong than go right. So we're kind of designed by evolution to pay attention to negative things, focus on them, attend to them very carefully, whereas we kind of just don't even notice the slow, gradual progress. So there must be something along the lines of that. But why homophobia? What is the Okay, give us a kind of a twofold one, a deeper ultimate cause. Why would humans be homophobic at all? Is it just like we're racist, we're tribal, we're xenophobic, whatever? And then what specifically in the American culture, drove that for so long?
I think it's multi-pronged. I would say the first and probably most important reason is religious based. Homosexuality is condemned in the Old Testament, and then it becomes a part of the Christian religion. Although there is a there have been historians who would say that there actually was an era earlier on when there was Christian tolerance of homosexuality, but certainly the Judeo-Christian tradition in America was extremely. I mean, homophobic isn't really the word to use. That's kind of a modern term. This was like an eliminationist attitude. I mean, and there was in some states the death penalty for homosexuality. Um, so that's the main one, I think. And I think even up to this day, if you look at where are there pockets of homophobia, where does it mostly come from? It's still, religious areas or organized religion is responsible for a lot of it. There for a long time was the medical establishment. The medical establishment deemed homosexuality an illness, a mental illness. And it wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association lifted or removed homosexuality from the DSM, the list of medical conditions, of psychiatric conditions. I also think there's on some level, and Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, has written about this. There's the issue of disgust, and this applies more to male homosexuality. I think for some people, they're just sort of a basic disgust, perhaps, with same-sex sexual acts is part of it. And then there's an issue that I read about in my book, which is why I decided to start my book around the Roosevelt administration on World War II, which is the when homosexuality becomes a national security threat. And so it kind of transforms or it evolves from being a sin, a crime, a mental disorder. It also becomes a national security threat with World War II. And the reason, the purported reason, is that gay people will be more susceptible to blackmail, that they will do anything to protect this very shameful secret from getting out, so to speak, including give secret confidential information to an adversarial foreign power. And that is ultimately the reason that FDR decides to ask for Sumner Welles' resignation. He actually wanted to protect him, and he did for years. And it's in 1940 when this incident on a train where he propositions some porters, that's when that happens. But it's not until 1943, after the Second World War begins, that you have some senators who've heard about this story on Capitol Hill. They start threatening investigations, and then FDR has to basically demand his resignation. So World War II is fundamental. And this is really when the homosexual becomes a kind of public enemy in the public imagination, that he lives a secret life, just like spies, just like communists, right? When the Cold War begins, that's when it really kicks into high gear with McCarthy. And so the homosexual becomes a public enemy, largely due to the securitization of homosexuality.
Right. Just to dwell on that for a moment, I do think the disgust factor is probably important. If you take something like Jonathan Haidt's 5 Moral Foundations, disgust, sort of bodily purity / disgust over impurity is one of the big 5 that drives people, conservatives more than liberals. The last 3 are obedience to authority, or sort of respect for authority and rule and law, kind of faith, flag, family, cohort, and then disgust. And, this, sort of biblical injunctions against eating certain foods and avoiding certain diseases, and then avoiding certain people. The people themselves get associated with disease, contagions. And so populists and authoritarians famously, just kind of associate the Jews with lice, or Mexicans coming here, they're rapists and they're bringing us disease and drugs, and to use a more modern example, and the human psychology seems to just glom right onto that. Oh yeah, this is terrible. We do not want these people amongst us. I think that gays must have been just one of those, like in Leviticus, if a man lies with another man. Well, my joke was that supports marijuana legalization. He must be stoned. Yeah, okay. So, but yeah, that's kind of all lumped into that, right? Drugs, sex, rock and roll. It's all it's a kind of social contagion that we as a nation want to kind of protect ourselves from. It's like, again, back to the libertarian thing. What's wrong with pornography and prostitution? Again, consulting adults. I'm not talking about teenagers being abused or anything like that, but just consenting adults who choose to work as sex workers. What's wrong with that? Nothing. Well, but if they're in this neighborhood, then it's going to bring the neighborhood down, property values go down, kind of moral corruption of the community, and you expand that out to the nation. Or pornography causes, young men to misperceive women a certain way, and that's going to spread as kind of a contagion. I think it must be in that kind of that category.
Yeah, and I would actually add another too, which I didn't mention, which is just ignorance. And I think the most remarkable transformation in public attitudes has been on this question of homosexuality. You alluded to it earlier with how recent gay marriage is, but if you just look at what public attitudes were towards the issue of, say, gay people teaching in public schools, or the belief that gay people were more likely to be pedophiles, these were widely held views not that long ago. And this has been, you talk to opinion pollsters, they'll tell you there hasn't been a more dramatic, swifter, more dramatic change in public attitudes than on homosexuality. And why is that? It's because gay people started coming out of the closet, and suddenly this idea that people had of what the homosexual was, he's a criminal lurking in public bathrooms trying to rape children, or he's a communist spy. All these prejudicial beliefs were revealed to be complete, balderdash when you realize, oh, my next door neighbor is gay, or my son is gay, or the teacher, or the milkman, right? And you realize gay people are just like everybody else. I think that played a huge role, maybe the most important role in transforming public attitudes.
Yeah, I think so. I made that argument in the moral arc in my chapter on gay rights, citing people like Jonathan Rauch in his book. That basically he just made rational arguments. Here's the evidence. Here's the claim. Here's the evidence. Here's what we know, and so forth. And you probably do need laws still to change society, but underneath those, you can't force people to believe something. But if you can reason with them, ultimately, you can show that if their belief is incorrect, that is the long-term goal there, I think, and that so much of that surrounds that. Almost conspicuous by their absence is lesbians in your book, and I agree with your explanation. Well, why are there not more lesbians in Secret City?
There are several reasons. I mean, first of all, there are some lesbians, and we can talk about them later if you want. I mean, the reason why they're not nearly as many as men is for a simple reason. This is a book about political power in the nation's capital from 1933 to 1995. And the vast majority of people who held political power in that time period were white men. Very few women at all, never mind lesbians. In fact, it's not even really until the Clinton administration, frankly, that you get women in large numbers and appreciable numbers starting to assume leadership roles in the federal government. It had always been up to that point. There was, I think, FDR appoints the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins, Department of Labor, and then like every president would have like the token woman in his cabinet, usually in health and human services, right? Like one of the caring departments. And it's not really until Clinton that you get Attorney General Janet Reno. His first lady, Hillary Clinton, is, she changes the role of the first lady. So just women are just not, and it's unfortunate. I think our country would have been a better place if we hadn't discriminated against women. So women just don't have the place that men have. Same goes for African Americans, by the way. I've been criticized for not having more African Americans in the book. But again, I mean, for even more so than women, Black people were excluded from positions of power. And then, but back to the women issue, if you're looking at who has a security clearance in Washington, which puts you under the greater scrutiny for security clearances and background checks, which is where a lot of the hunting of gay people takes place, and the purging goes on in these security background checks. Background checks. But the vast majority of them are men. To the extent that women do have jobs in Washington, it's in administrative jobs. They're not getting those high level security clearances. And I'd say the last reason there aren't more lesbians in this book is because male homosexuality was just targeted more by law enforcement, by the state. It's gay men in the 1930s and onwards who are seeking out sexual partners in public places like parks and restrooms, because frankly, there aren't really any other ways to meet someone. It's gay bars that are being raided by the police. Lesbians are not finding each other in those sorts of situations that put them into conflict with the law. So if you look at the people who are being arrested for homosexual offenses, whether it's sodomy or maybe dancing or holding the hand of someone of the same sex, it's by and large men. So for those reasons, that's why there aren't as many lesbians as gay men in this book.
Yeah. Do you think that's because men generally, according to evolutionary psychologists...
one more point, Michael. One more point. One more point. According to the latest poll, Gallup, I believe, there are twice as many male homosexuals than there are female homosexuals. So
really?
For whatever reason, male homosexuality is, I believe that's the case. That's what I believe I read. For whatever reason, maybe there are more bisexual women. Okay? So maybe that's accounting for it, but I believe the latest poll shows that male homosexuality is twice as prevalent as female homosexuality, but by which I mean, exclusively homosexual or exclusively lesbian.
Yeah, that actually melds well with what I was about to say. I had David Buss on the podcast who wrote this book about men behaving badly. And he studies human sexuality and dating, mating behavior, and so on. And there's just this vast gulf between men and women. Men are really far less choosy, far more risk-taking. Women are more risk-averse. They're very careful, cautious about how many, how many dates they have to go on before they'll be intimate with a partner. I think the average was 7, and for the men, it was like less than 1. Can we just do it right now before the first date, right? and on the dating sites, and now they have like millions of data points from these dating sites. How many of the profiles you scan would you go out with? And for the men, it was like 96%. For the women, I think it was 4.5%. These poor guys on these dating sites have next to no chance of getting a swipe right or left or whatever it is. Right. So it could be that the lesbians at the time, maybe half in number, were also much more risk-averse, careful, cautious, and just less, active or aggressive about seeking partners. They just found each other quietly under the radar and no one noticed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And that's, if you look at, I can speak of my own, experience as a gay man who has lesbian friends. There's an old joke, what does a lesbian bring to a second date? A U-Haul. And what does a gay man? What does a gay man bring to a second date? What's a second date? Right. So that's kind of that's sort of the joke, sort of the joke we have among ourselves.
Right.
So yes, gay men and lesbians are very different. Just as men and women are different, it's actually, if you think about it, the gay male social world could not be more different from the lesbian social world, for all those reasons that men and women are different.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, so Roosevelt, you kind of think of him as a super liberal champion of the little guy, the oppressed people, minority, and so on. How much of the homophobic culture of his time did he inculcate, or did he just quietly resist it, but can't do so publicly? What's your sense about Roosevelt?
Well, there's sort of two gays. Well, he was involved in a gay scandal when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, when he was basically in charge of this plan to entrap gay men in the vicinity of a naval base in Newport, Rhode Island. And this became quite a big scandal. Although, to go back to my earlier point about how homosexuality was an unmentionable vice, the New York Times reporting on this in 1921, actually in the headline of the article, the subheadline, it said details are unprintable. So that's, that gives you an idea. So I mentioned the Sumner Welles case, and he really defends Welles. And when William Bullitt brings the evidence of Welles's homosexuality, of Welles, importuning these porters on the presidential train, FDR's initial response is, well, he wasn't doing it on government time, was he? Um, and Welles was also drunk when it happened. And this is a long time ago. And powerful men could get away with things that they can't now. And FDR, according to his own son, he was a very loyal friend, but also he was willing to forgive men things that they did when they were drunk. And that was basically his attitude towards Welles. At the same time, however, it's important to note there's another scandal brewing involving a unnamed senator who in May 1942 is identified by the New York Post, which at the time was a liberal newspaper. It was the newspaper of the liberal intelligentsia in New York City. Um, they accuse a Senator X at first, that's how they refer to him, Senator X, of frequenting a house of degradation, an all male house of degradation near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, that they also allege is frequented by Nazi spies. And they kind of build up the story for a couple days. They're kind of, printing more and more information over the course of the week. And then finally, they name this senator as David Walsh, who was a conservative Democrat from the state of Massachusetts. And importantly, he had been an isolationist and a very strong critic of FDR's policies from within the Democratic Party. Now, while this is happening, FDR is basically quietly encouraging. This, by the way, is the first outing in American politics when a gay public official's identity is revealed publicly. FDR is basically quietly encouraging this. He's sending notes to the general counsel of the New York Post, who's a friend of his, egging them on. He likes this, right? So it shows you the way in which homosexuality becomes a political weapon. And there really isn't much principle. FDR simultaneously can be defending his good family friend and Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, who's being smeared as a homosexual. He can defend him while at the exact same time be egging on an attempt to smear one of his political adversaries as gay. And this is something we'll see frequently throughout the course of the book, is that there really isn't much principle when it comes to this issue of homosexuality. And by the way, neither left nor right. I mean, one of the things I discovered in this book, we associate gay rights with the left, but that is not the case really until the late 1970s. And there are multiple examples of left-wing progressive people using homophobia or the gay smear to attack their enemies. And this is actually one of the first that I write about, is the New York Post, this liberal pro-FDR newspaper, in cahoots with the Roosevelt administration, is outing one of their adversaries, David Walsh.
Right. So there, I guess maybe political Machiavellianism triumphs over whatever your attitudes toward other people's private lives might be. And you never know what's in the heart of somebody. When I always remind my students, when I remind them that Obama and Hillary were against gay marriage as late as 2008. But of course, that was the culture at the time. What's in their hearts? I don't know. You got to say what you got to say to get elected. Right. So they're probably, it's hard to believe that either one of them would be in any way homophobic or against gay marriage. You just don't know. It seems hard to believe at that time, but maybe people have to say what they have to say to get elected. Politics is a different kind of game. So, but back in Roosevelt's time, okay, so the Second World War begins. You have the business of what is it called, the pink swastika, right? There was a element of homosexuality in the Nazi Party.
One of the Yeah, I mean, one of the themes in this book is how homosexuality gets associated with everything that's awful, and in particular with the nation's enemies, whoever the nation's enemy is at that point in time. And so, yes, I came across multiple references in government documents in the 1940s during the war where there is this belief that the Nazi Party is basically a kind of homosexual cabal. And it's really based on this one figure of sorry, I'm forgetting his name. The head of the SA.
Ernst Röhm.
Ernst Röhm, excuse me, Ernst Röhm. who's the head of the brown shirts, right? The real nasty Nazis, the real nasty. I mean, all of them were nasty, but these guys were particularly nasty. They were the ones who roughed up people in the streets. And he was an openly gay man. And Hitler, was willing to tolerate this. And of course, he becomes an early victim of Hitler with the Night of the Long Knives. But this becomes this belief that because of Rome, and Rome did have some gay men around him, perhaps, but there's this belief that the SA is this sort of gay cult, and it's this, and there has been this kind of fascination of fascism and homosexuality. People they associate fascism with homosexuality. It's a cult of masculinity. It's this obsession with the body. So there is, in that way, you can see how people might make that association. But I found, early in World War II, just weeks after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the predecessor organization to the CIA, this is America's first civilian intelligence agency, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. They get a proposal from like a research institute in New York that researches homosexuals, when they're proposing that, look, because homosexuals are barred officially from serving in the military, which, by the way, very few were actually barred. A lot of gay people were in the military in World War II. But they said, because of there's this official prohibition on homosexuals in the military, why don't you recruit patriotic homosexual men to infiltrate the Nazi high command? Because we know that it's riddled with homosexuals. And there are 2 OSS wartime reports that are where they do these psychological evaluations of Hitler and Nazism, and they elaborate at length on this belief that the Nazis, there's something gay about them, that Hitler might be gay himself, that the stab in the back theory might be this sort of, latent homosexual desire / fear of being sodomized. I mean, it's all this very strange stuff. But yes, there is this belief, and we kind of mock this. If you've ever seen The Producers, the Mel Brooks movie, or the musical, which is one of my favorites, they make fun of this belief that they actually portray Hitler as being this very fey, flamboyant gay man, and we laugh at that. But there's actually a basis in this. So there was a belief that homosexuals were more predisposed to be fascists, and then of course right after, the Cold War begins, and then all of a sudden homosexuals are predisposed to be communists.
Right. Yeah, that's really funny. Yeah, so you have that that line, contagious sexual aberrancy was the fear, that it's like a social contagion that can spread, spreading the gay lifestyle and all that stuff. So that would be the argument. But you also make the point here, and yet the very skills gay people had to develop to survive, studiousness, compartmentalization, discretion, itinerancy, made them uniquely qualified to sensitive tasks like espionage or high-level advising.
Yeah, I think that's in the New York Times review of my book, and it's true. And it's a great shame, right? Because gay people were, for these reasons, presumably would have had great talents at being spies. And I actually do identify a number of them in the OSS, a number of gay men and women who served with distinction. But it's unfortunate that those skills, perhaps, they weren't tapped. They weren't seen as being useful skills. Instead, we got the complete opposite, which is this belief that they'll be traitors. They'll be spies, but not for their own country, for other countries.
Right. They could be turned a double spy or something like that. You write, even at the height of the Cold War, it was safer to be a communist than a homosexual. A communist could break with the party. A homosexual was forever tainted. That's an interesting contrast I hadn't thought about. That must pick up around late Truman era, early Eisenhower time.
Yeah.
So the Cold War's getting
like I write about specifically the character of Whittaker Chambers, who was both.
Right.
Whittaker Chambers in the 1930s was a courier in the communist underground and a gay man. He would later say that these were not connected, that they just happened to coincide. But in 1948, he is a very well-regarded conservative journalist at Time magazine, and he comes out, so to speak, saying that he had been a communist in the 1930s, and he accuses Alger Hiss, a former high-ranking State Department official and at the time president of the Carnegie Endowment. He accuses him of having been a member of the Communist Party and a spy. Also, Chambers quietly or secretly, he never publicly acknowledges this, he secretly, confidentially tells the FBI about his past gay life because he's concerned that the His forces will use this to discredit him. And this does not become and the His forces, if you want another example of sort of the progressive homophobia, the His forces do launch a whisper campaign against Chambers about him being gay. They basically allege, not explicitly, but they're spreading the word that Chambers is making up these accusations that Hiss was a spy because he's a spurned and vengeful homosexual. Hiss would later tell people in private that it was fairy vengeance, is how he would describe Chambers. All of this was false, by the way. Hiss was a communist spy. Chambers was right. But it shows you that, you know, the someone who was a communist could come out as a former communist, and you could actually go on to great success. Chambers becomes one of the most important figures in American conservatism. He could never reveal publicly that he was gay. That would be the end of it. There was no return for a gay person, and so that's why I make that claim.
Right, but was it because the belief was if you're gay, you're just born that way and you can't change? Because that certainly wasn't the case all the way up until the 90s, right? When conservatives argued it was a lifestyle choice and you could change through these, you know,
right,
religious programs and so on.
I think in this period in the 1940s and 50s, it almost didn't matter. If you engaged in this behavior, it was de facto evidence that you were sick and a criminal and a sinner, right? This trifecta of terrible things. And you don't have any, first of all, you don't have any public figures who are gay or anti-gay or ex-gay, excuse me, right? There's no one who can, there's no one in the 1950s who's publicly saying, oh, well, I was a homosexual. And I, found God or whatever, or I weaned myself off of it. That doesn't exist. That really is sort of the whole ex-gay thing, by the way, that's very much a kind of evangelical Christian conception. I mean, Catholics have never had this conception. Catholics, my understanding, I'm not a Catholic, but they understand that homosexuality is maybe something that you cannot have any control over. And so what Catholics tell gay people is just, well, don't be a practicing homosexual, which is a very cruel and unreasonable, and I would say, frankly, evil thing to tell gay people, that there's something wrong with them. But it's the evangelicals who come up with this whole idea that you can be, an ex-gay, and they have conversion therapy, a very harmful, dangerous practice to try to make this happen.
But of all people, Catholics, given their history we've discovered in the past 20 years or so, oh my gosh.
Well, yeah.
And I often yes. wonder if these young priests are already gay and they're migrating toward an environment where they're more accepted, or it's just, not as bad, or if less likely, I think they're becoming gay when they become priests and they can't marry or whatever.
Yeah. Well, there's a book that came out a couple years ago. I think it was In the Closet of the Vatican, and it's this very sort of sensational tell-all. And it basically describes the Catholic Church as being, the most gay institution in the world. I mean, it sounds like the Castro in the 1970s or something. I mean, just the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on there. And of course, it's all very deeply repressed, and it's not healthy. I'm not saying this is in any way a good thing. But yes, I do. I think you do get a lot of men from certain social backgrounds, very conservative social backgrounds, who perhaps feel that this is the way that they can serve God. That if they're guilt-ridden by their sexuality, that they can maybe atone for it. That they'll be celibate, and sexuality can be very contorted by that. It can be deformed when someone does that to themselves. I think it's a very cruel thing to expect.
Yeah. People. Remember when that book came out? I didn't read the book, but I read Andrew Sullivan's review of it. And his comment was, I had no idea how gay the Vatican is. All the artwork and the outfits. It's hilarious.
Right. The costumes.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the purging and the hearings and all that stuff, and how the subject of your book is kind of wrapped into that.
Yeah, so in February 1950, Joe McCarthy gives his infamous speech to the Republican ladies of Wheeling, West Virginia, where he waves the list in his hand, where he says there's the names of 205 communists in the State Department. And then just a couple of weeks after that, less than 3 weeks after that, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, is called up to Capitol Hill to testify about these charges. And he brings with him a deputy who, in passing, they're talking about the people who have been fired from the State Department. And in passing, it is revealed that 91 homosexuals have been fired over the previous 3 years. And this just shocks everyone, the notion that there are so many. And by the way, I should add, in 1948, there's a very important development, which is the Kinsey Report comes out. And one of the key findings of the Kinsey Report is that there's 10% of men, essentially 10% of men are homosexual. That number, I think, is actually much higher than the actual number. It's probably 3 to 5%. But you can imagine the effect that this has on the country. I mean, this just drives people insane. I mean, they didn't, the notion that there would be that 1 out of every 10 men is a homosexual. So you get this kind of sex panic in American society. And it's coinciding, by the way, with the Cold War and this fear of communists. And so, we have all these homosexuals that we can't recognize, right? I mean, we thought we knew what they looked like. They were very effeminate and, they're very recognizable. Well, apparently they're not very recognizable because 1 out of every 10 of them are gay. And then you have this other threat of communists who are also being portrayed as, hiding behind every corner. And so these two fears become merged in what's called the Lavender Scare. We all know about the Red Scare. Lots of books have been written about it, movies, The Crucible, one of the most famous American plays, right? We know much less. We're not taught about the Lavender Scare, which to my mind is actually worse and more egregious. Because unlike the Red Scare, and this is why I'm actually very glad to be talking to the publisher of Skeptic magazine, because if there's one quality that's missing throughout my book, it's skepticism. Very rarely does anyone express skepticism towards these claims about gay people. Just everyone, left and right, they swallow them up whole without even thinking about it. So the Red Scare does have a basis in reality. There were some communists, including high-ranking ones in the American government, Alger Hiss. Communism was something to be scared about. It's an evil ideology that was, marching its way across Europe, enslaving people. Communism has tens of millions of deaths on its account, right? So there was reason to be concerned about communism. McCarthy was a total demagogue, and he completely abused his power, and he exaggerated it, and his actions led to great destruction. But there was a basis for it. There was something to be concerned about. The Lavender Scare, there is no basis whatsoever. There's not a single example of a gay person committing espionage because they're gay. In fact, in the early 1990s, the Defense Department did a study during the Gays in the Military debate. And they studied, I believe, 105 cases of Americans who had committed espionage. 6 of them were gay. Not a single one of them did it because they were blackmailed into doing it. It was for money or perhaps ideological purposes. Homosexuality had nothing to do with it. And the entire myth of the gay traitor, it's the only shred of evidence that is ever cited to support it, is a case involving the head of the Austro-Hungarian counterintelligence in 1913, a man named Alfred Radel, who was a traitor, he was a spy, and he was gay. And it is believed, this is right on the eve of World War I, he's exposed. And the Austro-Hungarian military is so embarrassed by this that they basically put out the story that he was blackmailed by the Russians into being a spy for the imperial czarist regime. It turns out that wasn't even true. He was doing it for money. The Russians didn't even know he was gay. He had very expensive tastes. He owned multiple cars. He had a wine cellar with like 5,000 bottles. The guy wanted money. But when the CIA is reporting to Congress in the early years of the Lavender Scare, in the State Department, and they're talking about the threat that gay people pose as potential double agents and spies, the only case that they can cite is this decades-old case involving this Austro-Hungarian, military intelligence guy, which turns out not to even have been true. But it's just widely believed, and no one even questions it. There's one guy I write about, Max Lerner, who was a great sort of liberal crusading journalist, who interestingly was working for the New York Post at the time. And he comes down to Washington in the midst of this. And he writes a 12-part series, which I highly recommend you read. You can get I can send you the clips. I got them on microform. It's in the New York Post. It's called the Washington Sex Story. And he's going around Washington interviewing all these supposed experts on homosexuals and their place in the government. And he just finds that there's no evidence for this. And the conclusion that he comes to, and again, he's a man of his time, he says, yes, these homosexuals are sick and they should probably seek help for it. But I find no evidence that they are more liable to be traitors than alcoholics or any other group of people who might have some sort of secret to keep. And there's no reason to explicitly target and purge them. There's practically nobody else is saying this. It's just this, it's one of these things that just becomes like J. Edgar Hoover having worn a dress, right? It just becomes a part of the zeitgeist. Everyone just assumes without questioning that we need to purge gay people from the government, and we need to expend vast resources on this to do
right,
it.
Because if that were true, then wouldn't a similar argument be made that, let's say, married men who have an affair would be exploited and blackmailed by, say, Soviet spies that find out about it? Or worse, the Soviets could do the honey trap thing where they send in an attractive woman and the guy sleeps with her, they record it, and then, threaten to tell his wife if he doesn't divulge some secrets or something like that. That seems like a reasonable argument if you're going to believe the other thing.
Well, there were people, I believe, who did lose their jobs because of that, because it was believed that might be. But of course, they weren't purging heterosexuals in their entirety, right? I mean, all men are susceptible to those sorts of temptations, right? And it never sort of crossed the minds. It never sort of crossed the minds of the leaders of our national security state at the time that by creating this category of the homosexual that was then liable to be fired, you were basically serving our Soviet adversaries on a silver platter. You're giving them an opportunity to induce treason. If you were just to say, look, if you're a homosexual, tell us, we're not going to fire you. That's it. And then there wouldn't be a threat of treason or a threat of blackmail anymore. In fact, there's a case I write about of Joe Alsop, who was a very famous newspaper columnist who was gay. He was a real arch Cold Warrior. And he's visiting Moscow in 1957 to do on a reporting trip. He interviews Khrushchev, the leader of the Communist Party. And during this trip, he's set up in a honey trap operation by the KGB. They introduce him to a very handsome young man who invites him back to his hotel room. Photos are taken. And they try to then they try to threaten Alsop into becoming an asset of theirs, an informant of theirs when he returns to Washington. What Alsop actually does is he writes a 9-page confession that he gives to the CIA, explaining. He says, "I'm a homosexual. I've been one since boyhood. I've sought treatment for it. I can't fix it. This is what I am." He goes into the details of how this honey trap operation began. He does everything that would have been expected of a gay person in this situation. But the policy doesn't change, right? Like they still keep this policy of exclusion in place. So it was a really irrational policy that hurt our country. It made us weaker, and it ruined a lot of lives unnecessarily.
Yeah, let me just riff out loud for a moment on what an explanation might be. There's something called pluralistic ignorance, that is the spiral of silence, where everybody believes everybody else believes something. Even if you don't really believe it, you're not quite sure, but it seems like everybody else does, so I'll just kind of accept it. In other words, we kind of trust in authorities or trust in our social group. So this is called social proof. I can't fact check everything, but everyone around me believes it, so okay, it's probably true. And in most cases, that probably is the way it is. And then I was thinking about this with writing about conspiracy theories and QAnon. How can anybody possibly actually believe that Hillary's running a secret satanic pedophile cult out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C.? Well, one guy believed it, Edgar Welch. He went there with his gun to break up the pedophile ring, right? Where's the basement? There is no basement. Yeah. What? And he later apologized and so on. But when people say they believe it, that word, belief, is doing a lot of lifting there. Do they really believe it, or is it more what I call a proxy conspiracy theory? That is, well, maybe not that one's not true. But that's the kind of thing those Democrats would do. That's the kind of thing Hillary would do. I don't like that. And remember the scandals in the 90s with the Clintons and the people that were killed, Vince Foster and all that stuff. Yeah, maybe there's no pedophile ring at that pizzeria, but there's something going on here. And I'm just going to signal that I think, there's something to that.
Yeah, and I mentioned Jeffrey Epstein, right? So there is this sort of real guy who was up to no good sexually and had all these connections to powerful people, right? So there is there's no truth to Pizzagate or QAnon, but there is staring in front of them this rich and powerful guy who seemed to get away with it for a long time. And I do think that's what it is. But yes, is it pluralistic silence? Is that the term?
Pluralistic ignorance, kind of a bulky term, but the spiral of silence. Just people thinking that everybody else believes something.
Well, I see that a lot now. I think, and then believing it or not being, or and then they themselves believe it, or they are too afraid to speak out against it. They themselves, convince themselves.
The classic study on this was done with binge drinking on college campuses, and college students were polled, and almost all of them say, "Oh yeah, I think it's cool," but privately they say, "No, I don't want to do it," but everybody else wants to do it. So the majority don't want to do it, but the majority end up doing it because they think everybody else wants to do it, right? And I was looking at some recent polls or studies on, sort of 1930s Germany. Of course, Hitler had a lot of support for his economic policies that pulled Germany out of the Depression, but a lot of his anti-Semitic policies were not embraced by everybody, at least the eliminationist part of the Nazi regime's policy against the Jews. But by then, there was no more free press. They had prison camps for anybody that opposed the regime or anything or ever spoke out. And everybody could see that people were being shuffled away in the middle of the night, and they never saw them again, anyone who spoke out. So you just keep your mouth shut. So, that's a little bit of combination of, kind of an oppressive regime and a spiral of silence. Well, everybody else seems to like the Nazis. I'm not so sure about them. And, the Jews, I don't know. And then by then you can't speak out, right? If you get in trouble. So maybe, go back to your book, maybe in the 1940s or 50s or even 60s, if you spoke out against government policy against gays, you yourself could be a target or risk your career advancement or something like that.
Yes, or perhaps be assumed to be gay yourself, right? Why else would anyone advocate? Why else would anyone advocate for these people? And in fact, that doesn't really happen until I write about him. He's a character in my book, a man named Frank Kameny, who I don't know if you knew him when he was alive, but he was someone who I think you would have really liked. He was an atheist. He was a Harvard-trained PhD astronomer and just a very, pragmatic guy. I got to know him in his later years. But anyway, Frank Kameny, he is working for the Army Map Service in 1957. And this is the predecessor to the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. This is 2 months after the Soviets launched Sputnik into space. So it's the beginning of the space race. And what does the federal government do 2 months after this? They fire a Harvard-trained PhD astronomer because he's gay. That's Frank Kameny. And what Frank does is he becomes the first openly gay person in America, in a way. He is the first person to say, you know what, this is wrong. I'm not sick. It's the society that is sick. There's nothing morally wrong with homosexuality. I am not susceptible to blackmail. I deserve all the same rights and liberties that all of my heterosexual citizens, my fellow countrymen have. And he decides to challenge the government over his firing. And just to give you an example, again, of how lonely the homosexual was in America at this time, he tries to get the ACLU to support his struggle. They won't help him. The ACLU will not help a gay person who's been fired. They are basically in alignment with that policy. It's not something that they would challenge until later, until the next decade. So he tries to take his case up to the Supreme Court. They don't want to hear it. And he founds something called the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., which is the first real sustained gay rights organization in the United States. And that's founded in 1961. So it's 8 years before the Stonewall Uprising, which is a much more better known event in American history. But I would actually argue that the first meeting of the Mattachine Society here in Washington at the Hay Adams Hotel, I think, is probably more important, because that is really when, gay political organizing begins, and the arguments are based on the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They adopt tactics from the African American civil rights movement. They launched the first picket outside the White House for gay rights in 1965. And you can see photos of it. It's pretty incredible. It's a group of men and women, very well dressed. All the women are wearing, skirts beneath the knee, below the knee. Um, and they're just marching peacefully with placards that say equal rights for homosexuals. And it seems crazy at the time. I mean, everyone's looking at them like they're nuts, right? Laughing at them, spitting at them, calling them names. But we look back on it now, and it's just this tremendous prescience or moral foresight. In fact, when I talk about Frank, I think the best analogy I can think of for a gay person in 1957 to do what he did, and I think it's an appropriate analogy because Frank was an astronomer. It's almost like that story, I think it's a myth, of Galileo refusing to renounce his heliocentric view of the world, right? It's him, he's refusing to say that the sun revolves around the earth. That is basically what Frank did. I mean, imagine the moral courage and the intelligence and the stubbornness to tell the entire American media, government, religious establishment, medical establishment, you're wrong about gay people. I'm right. I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
That's an incredible thing.
Here's a picture of him right here. Yeah, and then I have you include a picture here of the of the march, that march you just referenced with the Mattachine Society.
Yeah.
Right. What does that placard say? Sexual preference is irrelevant to.
So you talk about great.
The sexual preference is irrelevant to federal employment.
You talk about great.
What a sign.
There you go. You talk about great skeptics in American history. I think Frank Kameny really should rank up there as one of the great skeptics.
I knew nothing about him until I read your book. I love that section. It was amazing. All right, so this gets us into the Kennedy administration. As we now know, JFK was, famously promiscuous, and apparently had sex with interns and anyone else like every other day. There was a story, and I was reading a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he actually arranged to have sex with one of his paramours like the night before, the missiles were about to be launched, but he couldn't perform because he was a little stressed out. We're facing World War III. Sorry, honey, the world may end tomorrow, so I really can't perform tonight. I mean, and given that he traveled with the Rat Pack and so on, you think, well, he must have been reasonably tolerant of gays in his administration. So what's the story there with JFK?
Well, he was actually remarkably. I mean, his best friend was gay, a man named Lem Billings. They knew each other from private boarding school. And then as he became an older man, as a politician, he kind of had this kind of coterie of gay male friends. Gore Vidal, the writer, who was actually related to Jackie by marriage. The White House arts advisor, William Walton. Truman Capote was sort of in that circle. And then the aforementioned Joe Alsop, who was never openly gay, but Jack Kennedy certainly knew. Yes, he was remarkably comfortable. There's actually a story that Gore Vidal tells in his memoir of when he was visiting Jack and Jackie with Tennessee Williams in Palm Beach. And the two of them are walking behind Jack Kennedy, basically admiring his posterior. And Gore Vidal tells this to Jack Kennedy, and Jack Kennedy laughs at it and says, "Oh, that's exciting." Which, to be a red-blooded heterosexual American male in 1960, when that exchange took place, or 1959, that is not the way that most men would react, right? But he felt comfortable in the presence of gay people, gay men, in a way that the vast majority of his peers did not. And I think it actually has something probably to do with what you were saying earlier with his sort of sexual promiscuity. Perhaps he had his own sexual secrets to protect, and maybe there was a sense of, there but for the grace of God go I, when he was thinking about other gay men. Now, I should add that these attitudes and this sort of comfort level, this higher comfort level that he had around gay people, it did not translate in any way into public policies. You still had, I mean, the Lavender Scare was still raging on. You still had people being purged from the government. Um, so there was no respite from that. But yes, I think as a man, as an individual, he was certainly distinguished himself from his really any of his contemporaries or really any president before or after
By the
in
way,
that
when
time
when
period.
when gays were fired, were they just brought in and said you are being fired because you're gay, or did they find other excuses to get rid of the person?
Well, oftentimes the evidence didn't even have to be that strong. It was a real kind of kangaroo court atmosphere. I came across files, of State Department investigations where, again, people are using this against enemies or people they don't like in the office. They would accuse them of having a certain walk that looked homosexual, or there's one woman who's accused of having a mannish voice, right, which indicates that she's a lesbian. And then you'd have these security, and yeah, I mean, we laugh at it, but it was crazy, right? It was a real witch hunt, and the evidentiary standards were not high. Were not high. But yes, people would be brought in, and if they had one gay incident in their past that could be proven or they admitted to, then they could be fired, even if there was a suspicion. I mean, they're just it was a really terrible there was no due process. Okay, this wasn't like the our legal system where we at least have an expectation of due process. That didn't exist, and it's not until 1975, largely due to the efforts of Frank Kameny, because he starts taking on cases of federal workers who are fired. It's not until 1975 that the federal government lifts the ban on gay people being able to work in the civil
Interesting.
service.
Yeah, witch hunt for sure because they had those search for the mark, the satanic mark, which could be like a mole or a scar, and if it was anywhere near the genitals, well, that's for
Yeah.
sure a mark. What constituted evidence in their documents, which by now is today sounds ridiculous, but they believed it, right? Okay, so this brings up into the 70s. Okay, so we have Nixon, and then he's out and Ford, and then Carter. Before we get to Reagan, just kind of give us a quick overview of the 70s of how things started to change then.
I think Nixon is fascinating because I think his views on homosexuality really kind of lend a window into
Mm.
his paranoia. And we all know he
About
was a kind of
everybody.
paranoid man with an enemies list and about everybody, but particularly, and you see it with his attitude towards homosexuality. He really adopts a conspiratorial view of homosexuality. I think one of the things my book shows is that homophobia, we talked earlier about why are people homophobic. There's a real conspiratorial element to homophobia that's quite similar to anti-Semitism, and that gays are accused of being, loyal not to their country but to some, transnational community, this, international secret fraternity of homosexuals. In fact, there's this term that I write about in the book, the
Mm, right.
Homintern. It's a
Mm-hmm.
play on the Comintern. Communist International is the grouping, the organization of international communist parties, the Comintern. There was in the 1950s there was a supposed Homintern, and it was believed that homosexuals, basically if there's two homosexuals in a room, then there must be some nefarious activity going on. And in fact, in the report that the Senate does a report on sexual perverts in the government in 1950, and there's a line in there where it says one homosexual can pollute a government office. And so it's the same kind of, it's very similar to anti-Semitism, right? This conspiratorial belief. They're not loyal to their homeland. They're loyal to they're clannish. They're loyal to other entities. And Nixon really has this view. And it's funny, we listen to it on the tapes, and I reproduce a lot of these White House conversations that were recorded. And he's going on and on about the homosexuals this, the homosexuals that. He believed that Hiss and Chambers were gay lovers. But he's one of the few people who believes that both that they were gay lovers, which was basically what the Hiss side was trying to accuse Chambers of. He believes that they were gay lovers and that Hiss was also a spy. So that's a very small Venn diagram of people, right? But Nixon believed it. Nixon is telling his aides that they were that way. That's the expression he uses. They were that way, Chambers and Hiss. Um, and then early on into the Nixon administration, there's an allegation made that three of his aides, his top aides, Dwight Chapin, John Ehrlichman, and John Haldeman, um, there's a disgruntled Nixon advisor who didn't get a job in the White House, and he's angry about it. So he spreads this rumor that the three of them are involved in a menage a trois at the Watergate. So there's a lot of nefarious activity going on at the Watergate, apparently. There's a leak that I write about, there's a national security leak in 1971 when this newspaper columnist, the one who was investigating the aforementioned supposed menage a trois, a guy named Jack Anderson, who was a real sort of thorn in the side of all presidents, but Nixon hated him. And Anderson got his hands on some confidential file. And he wrote about it in his column. And this happens all the time, by the way, when you're a president, that there are leaks and newspaper journalists write about them. He becomes convinced that he becomes convinced that the person who leaked this information from within the government to Jack Anderson is Jack Anderson's lover. And he is trying to find any evidence to prove that this is the case. And he's demanding of Ehrlichman, and he's sicking the FBI to wiretap people and all these sorts of things to prove this. It's basically it's a conclusion in search of evidence. It turns out that the staffer on the National Security Council who leaked this information to Jack Anderson, they were both Mormons and members of the same Mormon church. That's how they knew each other. But Nixon was convinced that they were gay. So it just kind of shows you that, again, because homosexuality was secret, people didn't know much about it. People were ignorant of it, right? It was a facet of human existence that people didn't know much about. That lends it to prejudice and conspiracy theory and bigotry. Because when you don't know anything about this group of people called homosexuals, then it's easy to kind of divine all these theories about them and explanations about what they're doing and how they behave and what they look like. And Nixon was a real example of this. The Ford presidency, I write about an interesting story having to do with outing, which is becoming a phenomenon in the late 70s and early 80s, because you have gay people now out of the closet. And they want to they believe that the more people who come out of the closet, the better, because that will educate the American people. And they're not wrong about that. But there's a tragic case involving a man named Oliver Sipple, who was an ex-Marine who saved Gerald Ford's life during the second assassination attempt. There were two assassination attempts on Gerald Ford within weeks of each other in September 1975. This one was by a woman who was associated with the Manson family. She aimed to shoot Ford as he was coming out of the hotel. It's currently the Westin Hotel in Union Square in San Francisco, and she missed him because Sipple knocked the gun out of her hand. Sipple was gay. He, like many gay people, he had come to San Francisco in the early 1970s to escape a real terrible life somewhere else. He came from Detroit. And what happens is that Harvey Milk, who was not yet a city councilor, but he was a budding politico in San Francisco, he wants the world to know that the man who saved the life of the President of the United States was a gay man, because he believes that will do a lot to disabuse people of their prejudice. And he leaks this to Herb Caen, who's a legendary newspaper columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle. And while Milk's motives might have been, noble, the impact was terrible, because what happens to Oliver Sipple, who was a private citizen and wanted to remain one, his family disowns him. His mother gives an interview basically saying, well, we were proud of Oliver, and then we found out that he was a queer. When she dies, his father won't let him come to the funeral. And Sipple basically becomes the target of all this media attention. He's the homosexual who saved the life of the president. And it basically ruins him, and he drinks himself to death. And I think it's a cautionary tale about outing, because you never know what someone is dealing with in their life, in their private life. You can never know what's going on with them. And I think that's why, as a gay person, I'm very hesitant when you're dealing with people who are alive. I think once someone's dead, they belong to history. But when you're dealing with someone who is alive, there are very few instances where I would support outing. And I think Oliver Sipple's story shows why.
Yeah, that's a good story. So let's get into the 1980s and Reagan. So there must have been some tension there between his cowboy image as a red-blooded American, and the fact that he worked in Hollywood for decades, and he and his wife knew lots of gays, and so they must have had some level of tolerance. Like somebody's like, oh well,
Yeah.
they're normal like us, and okay. So talk a little bit about Reagan and Nancy and all that.
Well, I think, yeah, personally, they had a lot of tolerance. There's a page in my photo insert, and it's just a page of Nancy and all of her gay male friends, and it's entitled "All the First Lady's Men." So she was just surrounded by gay men. Um, and Reagan, and I think it's interesting to note this, but Reagan was very sensitive, I think, to the perception that he himself might be gay. And not this has to do not with any, personality traits of his, but because he was an actor in Hollywood. And Lynn Nofziger, who was his communications director for many years, said this, that they were concerned, the kind of advisors to Reagan were concerned that because he came from Hollywood and they had gay friends in the industry, that the American public might suspect that Ronald Reagan was a homosexual. He says this in his memoir. And Reagan himself describes one of his earlier acting experiences. He's in a movie called Dark Victory with Bette Davis in 1939. And you have to understand, this is during the era of the code, the production code, when homosexuality was, you're not allowed to depict it on screen. And he's describing the director of this film, who happened to be a bisexual British director. He's describing how he wants Reagan to basically play the role of the gay best friend to Bette Davis. The way he describes it is, well, he wanted me to play this role as if he was the sort of fella who could sit in the girls' dressing room and dish the dirt with them while they got dressed, right? It's a very kind of long, euphemistic way of saying he wanted me to play a homo. Um, and he's upset by this, and he really doesn't want to do it. And so even portraying a gay role, or a role that has a touch of lavender to it, right? It's something he's sensitive about. And then in 1967, one of his first real, political challenges as governor of California, Drew Pearson, who I've mentioned before, who wrote a column with Jack Anderson. They published a column alleging that Reagan had fired that there was a group of Reagan aides who had an orgy at a timeshare in Lake Tahoe, and that Reagan fired two men because of it. Um, the story is not entirely accurate. It's not entirely accurate if this orgy ever took place, but Reagan had fired two men who were alleged to have been gay. And he gets very angry about this accusation when it's made in the press, partly because he wants to protect the identities of these men. So it comes from a good place. He doesn't want their families to be affected by this. He doesn't think it should be public information, right? He fired them as practically anyone in that position would have done. I'm not defending him, but any governor of any party, frankly, who was brought information that someone was gay probably would have done the same thing. And he's angry that this is becoming a press issue. It's becoming so he lashes out at Pearson. He denies the story. 2 weeks later, he has to admit that it's true, that he did fire these men. But then in 1970, so again, there's this kind of association with homosexuality, right? That there are these gay men working around Ronald Reagan. That's something that they have to be sensitive about, and that they are repeatedly, as we'll see in the book, they are sort of dodging this impression and these accusations. Then in 1978, Reagan actually does a very good thing on this issue when there is a ballot measure to prohibit gay people from teaching in public schools. And it's leading in the polls by an overwhelming margin. And then just a couple weeks before, a young gay activist who's still alive, who I interviewed, his name is David Mixner, a quite left-wing fellow. He started his career in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was a progressive left-wing Democrat. He comes up with the idea that, you know what, if we can get Ronald Reagan to come out against this proposal, we could reverse the vote because conservatives like him, they respect him. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a conservative libertarian case to Ronald Reagan that this measure to ban gay school teachers bad. It's bad on libertarian conservative grounds. He gets a meeting with Reagan. He sits down and he tells him, look, you're going to cause chaos and anarchy in the public schools because you're going to have students making these scurrilous accusations of homosexuality against their teachers. There's going to be all this bureaucratic red tape and tribunals and legal fees. And he knows that Reagan, when Reagan was governor, had lashed out about, crazy left-wing student activists on the Berkeley campus who were causing anarchy. So he knew how to appeal to Reagan's, small government libertarian beliefs. And he convinces Reagan to come out against this measure. And what happens? It's defeated at the polls by the same overwhelming margin, by the way, that it was predicted to win by. So that's an incredible story for me of the power of persuasion, of trying to meet people where they are and talking to people who you might disagree with on everything and finding common ground, and how powerful and productive that can be. Because that's ultimately what politics is about. It's about meeting someone halfway and compromising. And so that's a story I like to tell because I think it's a really good one. But of course, when he's president, unfortunately, AIDS is a dominating issue. It strikes just 6 months into his presidency, and he doesn't mention the word AIDS until his second term. And again, I trace it back to this. Well, there's two reasons for that. I think one is partly because of this rise of the Christian right, which he brings into his conservative coalition, who are very important, by the way, in his becoming president.
No.
Reagan, by the way, was not a religious person. He was quite cynical, I think, in appealing to them and using them for his political purposes. But of course, they're extremely anti-gay. They're extremely homophobic. They believe AIDS is God's punishment on homosexuals. So I think that's part of the slowness of the response by the Reagan administration. But the other, I think, is what I've referred to at the beginning of this question, which is there's this heightened sensitivity to this belief that there's a kind of homosexual aura around the Reagans. They come from Hollywood. Nancy has these gay friends. Reagan was an actor. There was this gay scandal when he was governor. There's this repetition of that gay scandal that I write about that doesn't become public, but they know about it. That's almost reported on. The Washington Post investigates it, right? So there's just this fear. There's this fear of homosexuality, and I think that has a lot to do with, I think, the poor response.
Yeah, that was unfortunate.
If
I recall, Jerry Falwell sat him down before, like in 1979, and said, "Look, I can deliver you millions of votes, but you gotta be pro-life. You gotta come out and all these Christian values." And so he did what I guess any politician do when they're not yet elected. You try to make everybody happy and get those votes.
Well, it's interesting. I reported in the book, but after Reagan came out against the Briggs Initiative, which was the ban on gay school teachers, Falwell actually attacked him after that. So maybe Reagan was bruising maybe he was bruising from that experience. Maybe he thought, you know what, I might support gays being allowed to be school teachers, but I have to temper that now.
Yeah, it could be
that I'm trying to become president.
But also back to your earlier point, Reagan, made a big deal about the fact he used to be liberal in the 1950s in Hollywood, and that was he the one who said, "I didn't leave the party left me," or at least he gave that impression. There's back to your example of
yes.
you can be a former communist and still be a champion because look, you realize the error of your ways, and now you're on the right side. Yeah, interesting.
Yes. Yes, yeah. I think that's that's a good.
Well, your two shortest chapters are on George H.W. Bush and Clinton. Is that because things just got so much better by the time we get into the 90s?
Yeah, the specter of homosexuality is sort of dissipating. The H.W. Bush chapter, I detail the life of this very enigmatic Washington figure whose name was Craig Spence, who was this kind of mysterious lobbyist for Japanese interests. He was a Republican conservative, had all these connections to the Reagan administration, and led this kind of secret gay life. And he becomes, in the summer of 1989, he becomes a sort of public enemy #1 for the Washington Times, which is the Mooney-owned right-wing newspaper in Washington, where they allege that he's at the center of this gay male callboy ring, that he's arranging midnight tours of the Oval Office for them, and they obsess. It becomes this, silly summer story in the summer of 1989. He becomes this kind of public spectacle. So that's who I write about in the H.W. Bush chapter, and then the Clinton chapter. Yeah, I end with him because in 1995, that's the year that Clinton lifts the ban on gay people receiving security clearances. Um, and while the closet doesn't end automatically, right, and there's still gay history is being made, and Clinton, he signs the Defense of Marriage Act and he implements Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So it's hardly is it an entirely positive record. But in terms of the scope of my book and what I'm writing about in the book, that's the end of the official prohibition on gay people working in the federal government. It ends in 1995, and that's really when what I call the specter of homosexuality sort of sets. It kind of it
Yeah, but
ends
even when you
in that period.
yes, I know. Yeah, you have to end
Also,
the
it's a
book
very
somewhere.
long book.
Right.
Yeah.
Testing readers' patience. But even when you're in power, say Clinton, you can only get so much done, right? I mean, Obama, I'm going to close Gitmo and I'm going to do this and pull the troops out. And then, my nod to conspiracy theories is you get into power and they take you in the back room and they go, okay, here's what's actually going on. Oh, I can't close Gitmo. No, you can't close, or whatever it is you want to do. But I told the people I would do that. Yeah, it's okay. Right. So maybe Clinton really wasn't in favor of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but that's all he could get in terms of Congress and so on.
I mean, that's the explanation that the Clintonites have given at the time and later, right? Was that we made this promise. It may have been premature, by the way, to make the promise during the campaign, and that becomes actually the first real scandal. Well, not scandal, becomes the first crisis of the Clinton administration is gays in the military because they try to do it immediately and they get all this pushback from the uniformed military. Um, I can't relitigate. I don't really write about it that much in the book. There's an entire book about the history of gays in the military by Randy Schultz, Conduct Unbecoming. Um, but yes, it may have been too much to expect that they could have lifted this ban so soon. Because you know what? It wasn't lifted until 2011, I believe, right? So it would take almost 20 years for the country to be in the place where that could be lifted. I'm not sure if the country was ready yet for that ban to be lifted at that time. I'm
Well,
not. I'm
Jamie,
not
I want to
sure.
be mindful of your time. It's a fabulous book. I loved it. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's so readable. You're
Yeah.
such a good writer. I also appreciate that about books. But before I let you go, I want to ask you about one
Thank you.
unfolding controversy that we've been dealing with regarding trans. And I'll just use, say, Andrew Sullivan and Helen Joyce. Andrew was the first person
Mm.
I heard make this argument that telling young boys who are attracted to other boys or girls attracted to other girls that they're not in fact gay, but that they're trans, they're in the wrong body. Helen Joyce makes this point even stronger in her book Trans, that it's almost a homophobic type argument. What happened to somebody wrote an essay, what happened to lesbians,
Yes.
and so on. And we don't know the answer to what's the
Yeah.
natural background rate of gender dysphoria and so on. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. What are your thoughts at this point in this unfolding controversy?
Well, I am concerned. It's not necessarily boys who are attracted to boys or girls attracted to girls. It's gender non-conforming kids who often, maybe in most cases, will grow up to be gay. Right? They are being told that they are actually the opposite sex, and to me, that seems to me like a kind of progressive homophobia. Because it's telling again kids who, if left alone, if left unmolested, will grow up to be healthy homosexual men and women. It's telling them that they're actually, try dating girls, right? You're telling a boy, right? Or maybe you're the opposite sex, and that's what the issue is. So to me, that seems to me very regressive. Um, and if one of the purposes of the gay rights movement was to expand our understanding of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. That you can be an effeminate man. You can be a man who likes to wear dresses, perhaps, or makeup. And that's fine. There's nothing morally wrong with that. Or you can be a tomboy. You can be a girl who is not into stereotypically feminine things and behaviors and dress. That's fine. That to me is what part of what the gay rights movement was about. This seems really to contradict that and seems quite regressive. And in many ways, it harkens back to what I was writing about in the 1950s with these really outdated gender stereotypes. And so I am concerned about it, and we have heard from detransitioners who have later come out, and these are people who have gone through transitioning to the opposite sex and then later regret it. And many of them come out and say, "I was just gay. and I wasn't comfortable with that. My family, was very homophobic and wouldn't accept me for being gay. So I thought, well, you know what? If I transition into a girl and date men, maybe that will be acceptable to them. So again, I think the science is out on a lot of this, but I do believe that we are um, rushing young
Yeah,
people
yeah.
into
The
things that they will
New York
later come
Post
to
had an
regret.
article of one of these guys yesterday. Yeah, Helen Joyce makes the point also. She's kind of a second wave feminist
Yeah,
that this is really
yeah,
kind of objectifying women's bodies. If I just
yeah,
bolt on some breasts and create a fleshy vagina for men to put their penis in, well, then I'm a woman. And it's like, no, this is what we've been fighting against. That we're just tits and ass and a vagina and nothing more. That
right.
it's not good.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
raging debate. That's
Right,
I'll leave
exactly.
it at that. It is a
All right, Jamie,
raging
thanks so
debate.
much for your time and thanks for your work. What are you going to do to top this magnificent tome?
Oh, thanks so much. I have lots of ideas for
Yeah,
future projects, and I haven't really settled on any one thing yet. So
yeah.
I'm still
And so, where can people
still
find you
searching for that
online?
next project to undertake. Well, Twitter, J Kirchick, Kirchick,
Perfect.
or my
All right, Jamie,
website,
thanks so much.
jameskirchick.com. Thank you.